This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 272, entitled Masculists Put Enormous Moral Pressure on Women. Description. This flyer explains why Masculists put such enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up, to become financially independent persons, in order to free men from manslavery, from working for a woman instead of working for himself, doing what he wants to do with his life. Those women who don't FIP up are punished by men by being forced to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, poor, and shunned. Now for the flyer itself. It's too sensitive. Can't center it. Masculists Put Enormous Moral Pressure on Women, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Why do Masculists put such enormous moral pressure on women? Why are Masculists so angry at fluffies? Why do Masculists even use the term fluffy, which is so derogatory of women? Masculists are men's livers. To an ignorant feminist, she's probably thinking, quote, what do men have to be liberated from? From a feminist perspective, men are the oppressors that women need to be liberated from. It is men who are the problem. There are only two sexes, so if Masculists think that men need liberating, do they mean liberating from women? That sounds ridiculous, given that men oppress women. So what do men have to be liberated from? The above is a very commonly held view amongst feminists and women in general. It's interesting to note for a Masculist how deeply unconsciously ingrained it is in women to think that, quote, men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies. This assumption is so basic to women that they do not even bring it to consciousness. So when they're confronted with a Masculist who rejects this assumption, most women react shocked, feeling deeply threatened, as though the Masculist rejection of female-imposed manslavery is a threat to her personal existence. The main answer to the above question, that is, what do men have to be liberated from, is from manslavery, from working for a woman and her kids, whom she considers as hers, especially when the divorce comes, instead of working for himself, doing what he loves and not what some female nor society imposes on him. Masculism is men's lib, that is, the liberation of men from the traditional role of being a manslave to a woman. A Masculist typically rejects marriage and paternity, similarly with the MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, who do the same. But Masculists are also politically active, whereas the MGTOW are politically passive, quietly rejecting the marriage market and paternity, spending their time doing what they want in life and not caring about what women or society wants. Masculists are usually contemptuous of this apolitical, wimpy attitude of the MGTOWs and are politically active, which is what this flyer is largely about. Masculists are not happy with the MGTOWs, claiming that the MGTOWs show no solidarity with the gender plight of other men and care only about themselves, so are selfish towards other men in that respect. Masculists, however, care very much about other men and aim to create, to socially engineer, a society that they label a FIP society, capital F, capital S. That is, a society in which all adults, particularly girls, are socialized and educated to be FIPs, financially independent persons, who do not parasite off the money of another person. Masculists are very conscious that we are far from being a FIP society today, because at age 16 in high schools in Western countries, about 3/4 of young women choose to become the opposite of FIPs, that is, fluffies. That is, traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money of a man, to have him pay for her, to have babies. To Masculists, fluffies, based on the word fluff, with connotations of being light, not serious, not responsible, not adult, not career competent, not FIP, are the enemy. This flyer is largely about why Masculists treat fluffies with such contempt, and why Masculists place such heavy moral pressure on them to FIP up, that is, become FIP, and not manslave a man. To a lot of people of both sexes, it's difficult to have a feeling for why Masculists show such hostility towards fluffies, saying strongly negative things about them, such as, quote, "Fluffies are immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin, to be wiped out, not by killing them, but by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, so that their fluffy genes are removed from the gene pool, leaving only FIP female genes." Most people are not original thinkers. Most people do things by habit, by custom, because it takes hugely less energy. When people are thrust into a new culture where everything is different and their learning curve is steep, their stress levels skyrocket and people become very uncomfortable. People prefer their comfort zone, living in their typical daily routine that does not require much original thought nor creative thinking. Go back about 2 centuries to the southern states of the US and look around. You'll see black Negro slaves everywhere, working on the cotton plantations. If you grew up in such circumstances, you'd probably not think twice about the Negro slaves. To you, they are simply part of the environment, as familiar to you as the furniture in your room. You don't give the Negroes a second thought. You grew up surrounded by slaves and do not question that the slaves are whites and the slaves are blacks. That is common sense for you. Then one day, you hear some northerner who calls himself an abolitionist. That is, he wants to abolish the system of slavery and have the field workers paid for their labor. The idea sounds crazy to you, radical, impractical, nutty. A few years later, you hear growing talk from the men in your social circle of seceding from the Union of the States, because the Northerners do not accept the Southern system of slavery of Negroes that is the bedrock of the Southern economic system. If the Northerners had their way, the South would no longer be the South, and God forbid, if the Negroes were given their freedom, perhaps they might attack whites, as has happened a few times in the recent past, you heard. You can't get your head around what the Northern abolitionists are saying. That is, that it is a moral outrage to have a slave. That is, someone who works for you, performs labor for you, creating products that you can sell and live off, but he does not get any reward for doing that, other than basic housing and food to keep him alive, to keep working for free for you. You just don't see that you are exploiting that Negro slave, forcing him to work for you, that you are robbing him of the product of his labor. He grows and picks the cotton, and you sell it and keep the money. You are a parasite of his labor, but you don't see that, because it is only natural that blacks work for whites, because it is the custom. It has been like that for your entire living memory. It is natural. You're probably seeing already where I as a Masculist am going with this little parable. Compare the exploitation of the labor of the Negro slave, together with the hostile reaction of the Northern abolitionists in the US in the 1800s, with the case of the exploitation of the labor of men, together with the hostile reaction of the Masculists in the 21st century. The two cases are very similar. Both involve the exploitation of the labour of another person, benefiting the exploiter at the expense of the exploited, which in modern times is the man-slave, exploited by the fluffy, who is the modern equivalent of the slaver of Negroes in the 1800s. The northern abolitionists were so indignant against Negro slavery that eventually the issue boiled up to cause the US Civil War, where the southern states so strongly disagreed with the northern states' moral rejection of southern slavery that they decided to secede from the Union and go their own way, keeping their slavery system in their own new nation, the Confederacy of States. The Northerners were outraged that the Southerners had broken the US into two and invaded the South to keep it in the Union with their superior population and industrial capacity. How, you may ask, are the two situations comparable? That is, between the sentiments of the abolitionists and the sentiments of the Masculists? Question mark. Take the role of a typical woman on the farm a century ago. She worked from dawn to dusk on the farm, with a constant stream of chores to do that kept her constantly busy, washing clothes, feeding the animals, tending her many children, cooking meals for the large family, tending the garden, doing the ironing, chopping the wood for the stove, hanging out the washing, bringing it in, washing the floors, etc., etc., etc. She was busy. She pulled her weight. She did not parasite off the labour of her husband, who worked in the fields with the plough and horses, doing the heavy work suitable for the man with his much greater strength and endurance than a woman. Then, in the 20th century, came the technological revolution due to the explosion of science in the 19th century. Electrical gadgets appeared in the home to hugely lighten the burden of household chores for women. For example, washing machines, dishwashing machines, clothes dryers, vacuum cleaners, electric irons, gas and electric stoves that created heat at the turn of a dial. Men invented household gadgets that revolutionized the lives of women. In the 1960s, an even greater revolution occurred with women, namely the male invention of the contraceptive pill, which allowed women for the first time in history to reliably control the number of children they wanted, which became typically 0, 1, or 2. So women with few kids and household gadgets found themselves with time on their hands. The upper middle class women got bored with being the traditional housewife and hankered to be like the men, with careers and education. So they created a social political movement called feminism, to socially engineer women into becoming careerists like men, but found that traditional men resisted this and did not like women in their working environment. Many men liked being able to escape female nagging and female prattle that they got at home by going to work, and were not at all happy when women started appearing in their workplace and bringing their nagging and prattle with them. This negative reaction and resistance against the women in the workforce on the part of men caused the feminists to radicalize and to criticize men for not accepting the new reality that women have the time to work, to have careers, because they have only 0, 1 or 2 kids now, and so have a career window of some 4 decades. This 4-decade career time window is the key factor in the liberation of men for the Masculists. To the Masculists, the fact that women now can work means that they now must work, because anything else is exploitation by women of the labour of men. That is, it's manslavery, and hence from the point of view of the Masculists is immoral, parasitic and contemptible. Take a more extreme case of a fluffy female, say in Japan or Korea, where the gender roles are about half a century behind the West. In Japan, for example, the husband overworks, working a typical 11-hour day with a 2 to 3 hour total commute time each day, getting home so late that he orphans his kids because they are already asleep. The wife is a housewife who has no job. She lives off the money her husband makes. She is totally financially dependent on him. She is a kept woman, whereas her husband overworks while she plays tennis. She has lots of free time to do what she likes. She spends lots of time with her friends and her hobbies. She has a very nice life. In Japan, the polarity of roles between the sexes is so severe that Jap fluffies have a saying: "A good husband is healthy and absent." Of course, this is from the biased perspective of the Jap housewife. From a masculist point of view, the Jap husband is a manslave to his fluffy wife. He works for her. He is a slave for her. She receives his income, taking his paycheck each month, giving him a modest allowance, and then spending the rest of his money on the kids, herself, the apartment, and her shoes. It's not surprising that the young generation of Japanese men, the so-called herbivore men, that is, grass eaters, in contrast to the carnivore men who hunt sex from women, have rebelled against the traditional salaryman role of the Japanese father. These young men, 2/3 of them under 35 in Japan, refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. They are MGTOWs, men going their own way, or as they are called in Japan, the herbivore men. And since this rebellion has been going on for about a decade longer in Japan than in the West, there's been more time for its political and social fallout to have made themselves felt, particularly in its impact on the birth rate and the beginnings of the population decline. Japan has now started to decline in population terms. At its peak, it was 128 million. It's now 127 million and falling. In 20 years, once the baby boomer generation has died off, the Japanese population will have fallen to about 80 million, forecasts predict. Thus, the rebellion of the Japanese herbivore men, plus other factors, has caused the Japanese population to fall. So the newly appointed Minister of Population is trying to persuade young Japanese males to be fathers again. But his admonition to the herbivore men generation to man up was just about the worst thing he could have said. The herbivores didn't listen to him. Young men in the Western countries around the world are waking up to the reality that women can now work. So why are there still countries where it's still the norm for women to be housewives, as in Japan and Korea? Masculists are very conscious that now that women can work, they must work, because anything else is parasitism of the labour of men, that is, exploitation of men, that is, manslavery. This issue of getting Japanese women to pay their way financially was a personal issue for me in the zeros. During the 90s, I was a researcher in artificial brains in Japan. I had a Japanese girlfriend who in many ways was the best I ever had. She was smart, very pretty, emotionally warm, funny, with strong libido, clear skin, healthy, etc. When I moved to take up a professor post in the US, she came to visit me to see if she could live in the US. She had retired by then and was living off her savings. Towards the end of her visit, she casually remarked that she could live in the US if I worked for her. That is, she was proposing the traditional Jap manslave role to me, so that she could sit on her fat, parasitic, fluffy ass and have me, the man, work for her, be the manslave for her, Jap style. Unfortunately for her, her Western boyfriend was a Masculist, who, once the full impact of what she was proposing had sunk into my consciousness, I exploded at her. Quote, "What you're proposing is manslavery. Go back to Japan, you fucking Jap fluffy. Go murder some Chinese. End quote. She left the next day, and that was the end of that relationship. In other words, I, as a masculist, exploded at her expectation of wanting to be a fluffy in the US, living as Jap women do in Japan, as fluffy parasites of men's money, as manslavers, as immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin, hated by the Masculists for their immorality, their exploitation, their amorality, their wickedness. Increasingly, young men are seeing the Masculist light and are totally unprepared to be exploited by fluffies. They piss on fluffies and put enormous moral pressure on fluffies to fip up. The Masculists want to see every high school have its own Masculist group to put strong moral pressure on young women at age 16 to choose to study career-competent majors that will allow them to study STEM fields, that's STEM, science, tech, engineering and math, and the professions at university, rather than choosing the soft option, that is intellectually easy, intellectually lazy, memory-based majors like languages, history, English literature, etc. at high school, instead of the analytic majors such as math and the sciences that will allow young women to study STEM and the professions at university, obtain a career-competent diploma and end up a real FIP as an adult, and not expect to parasite off a man in her 30s when her biological clock is ticking hard and wanting to have kids raised in a middle-class house that her manslave pays for. The Masculists are very conscious that women and society in general needs to be taught that a fluffy is a woman to be wiped out by men not having anything to do with them. Men are socialized to be fips. We evolved to be fips, that is, to understand and manipulate the world. So fipping comes naturally to men. Thus we men have the financial power to force women to fip up, because a fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some gullible manslave. Masculists need to create close contacts with the broadcast media to transmit the message to the masses, the millions, that women have to fip up or be punished by not getting a man. Fluffies need to be taught that they will rot on the shelf if they don't bother to get a career-competent education and become true fips. The Masculists want the creation of a FIP society, capital F, capital S. And to do that, women need to be taught that they have to be fips or pay a very heavy price, that is, being manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, poor, and spat at by men and by society for not bothering to fip up, for not bothering to make the effort to become career competent, and expecting to be able to parasite off the money of a man, expecting to be able to sexploit some gullible manslave to work for her. Masculists aim to so associate fluffiness with evil that young women feel strongly socially pressured to be fips. Otherwise they will feel that they have been socially outcast from the culture, forced to rot on the shelf, living miserable, lonely half-lives with their pets, with no man to call their own. One of the main strategies of the Masculists on the political front is to put enormous moral pressure on fluffies to fip up or be manless. We men have the financial power to do this to women, to fluffies. Already 2/3 of young men in Western countries have had their consciousnesses raised that having a relationship with a fluffy is bad news and will only lead to disaster. Having a relationship with a fluffy is a real hazard for a man. If he has kids with her, then he runs a 1 in 4 risk of being financially massacred by her in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts and have his life ruined. In about a decade, more than 90% of young men in many countries will not be prepared to marry and have kids until the gender laws are men-feared. For example, the divorce laws are men-feared. The that's paternity rejection right, is legislated, etc. will continue to reject paternity, thus wiping out the population. Masculists are very conscious that so many of men's gender issues would be solved if we all lived in a FIP society. The fluffy feminist hypocrites would be thrown out of the divorce courts. Divorce law would be reformed and made men fair. Alimony would be thrown out. Custody of the kids would be made joint by default. The owner of the house gets to keep it. Possessions are not divided in two. To create a FIP society, Masculists need to force women into a new consciousness in which they respect the rights of men. That is, do not expect to be able to parasite off them, sexploit them, expecting men to work for them in order to get a bit of access to her vagina from time to time. Soon, men will have the sex robot and the artificial womb, which will give men two powerful weapons to force women to FIP up or face oblivion from men by being utterly ignored. When men prefer to sex their bots and grow their own kids, then what is the point of having a woman around? Women nag, sexploit, get fat, are bad-tempered, irrational, emotional, hysterical, etc. Women will be forced to be very nice to men if they want to be able to compete with the sexbots and artworms. The sexbots will have luscious, curvy bodies, film star faces, and creamy, grippy vaginas that most women will not be able to compete with. A third of women are overweight, and another third are obese, making them sexually repulsive to men, who avoid such women like the plague. With sexbots and artworms, women will be more challenged than ever in terms of attracting men's attention. The Masculists will be able to lever the sexbots and artworms to their advantage, putting even more moral pressure on women to FIP up, to be nice, to stop dumping on men, misandrist feminazi style, and be nice, emotionally warm to men. Otherwise, men will just keep going their own way, ignoring women, looking down on women as inferior, amoral, child-minded beings with 10% smaller brain volumes, whom men have had to tolerate in the past. But now that women can pay their own way, and that men have their own sexbots and artworms, unless women are real FIPs and very nice to men, they will be left rotting on the shelf. Masculists are very conscious that their most formidable and most effective weapon to force women to FIP up is strong moral pressure on them to pull their own financial weight. A woman who does not bother to become a FIP will be rewarded, or rather punished, by being manless. Be FIP or be manless. No calculus, no baby. Fluffies rot on the shelf. Masculists see the close analogy mentioned near the beginning of this flyer between Negro slavery of the 1800s and manslavery today. Both are crimes, and both need to be wiped out. It took a civil war to remove Negro slavery in the US. It will take a powerful moral pressuring of fluffies in today's age to convert immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin fluffies into EMO FIPs, that is, equal moral obligations FIPs, that is, into women who feel strongly the moral duty to be FIPs and not expect to be able to parasite off the labour and money of a man. Masculists are conscious that society needs a real dose of consciousness raising to see manslavery for what it is. It is the sexploitation of men by women, by fluffy women, which is a major moral crime that needs to be wiped out, which is precisely what the Masculists are aiming to do. That is, to wipe out the fluffies, not by killing them, but by simply totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, shunned by society, so that their fluffy genes are removed from the gene pool, resulting in a culture in which nearly all women are FIPs, expecting to pull their financial weight and not parasite off a man. Once nearly all women are FIPs, we will have our FIP society. We can then men-fair the gender laws and liberate men, the ultimate goal of the Masculists, an obvious political, social goal, one that the apolitical MGTOWs have too little political vision to even see, let alone achieve. Its achievement will depend on the Masculists, who will have to convince some of the women to become female Masculists and vote with men to force the gender politicians to men-fair the gender laws. Men can't do it alone. Our numbers are too small. Once large numbers of women are female Masculists, who are also alarmed at the declining birth rate and the wipeout of the population, they will help